Welcome. This is the video on rocks with Mrs. Lehnert at HSHM. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe the types and characteristics of igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic rocks. So we spent a week learning about how different rocks form using different diagrams and this particular chart about the rock cycle. So you should already know how these different rocks form. Today we're just going to talk about very specific characteristics that these different rocks have. Remember that you should be recording this information on your notes page that you got in class. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the three different types of sedimentary rocks. And the first one is clastic rocks. These are rocks that form as a result of compaction and cementation of sediments. And this is primarily how people think of sedimentary rocks forming. You have compaction. This is that pressure where the sediments get smushed together or squished together. And then cementation is when they get cemented together or glued together. That word clastic actually comes from a Greek word, klastos, which means fragments. And you can actually see some of the fragments in this rock that are glued together with a bunch of tinier fragments, which are clay-sized particles, really like tiny, tiny little particles. And those tiny particles become the cement or the glue that hold these bigger rock fragments, or clasts, sometimes they're called, holding them together. The one on the right-hand side, this is actually a sandstone, and it's made up of sand particles. And you can see some of the sand particles have actually formed different layers, only because that they're different colors of sand, and that's why you see these different layers of sediments. All right, and the second type of sedimentary rock is called crystalline. It's called crystalline because these are rocks that form crystals, and they form those crystals because of evaporation and precipitation. Now, you're probably already familiar with evaporation, which is just when water evaporates, it turns into a gas, from a liquid to a gas. And usually we get these salt crystals when the ocean water evaporates and leaves behind these little crystals of salts. In this picture, these are really small crystals, but in that picture of the Himalayan salt, those are bigger crystals. And so you can get bigger crystals or you can get smaller crystals of salt. Now, a term that you might not be familiar with in this context is precipitation. You're probably familiar with precipitation being snow or rain falling through the air, but in this case, we're talking about the process of solid materials falling to the bottom of the ocean through the ocean water. It's the same kind of process. You're still talking about something that's solid and it ends up falling through something. In this case, we're just talking about salts or other materials like calcite, things that organisms are creating in the ocean, and then they solidify and they fall to the bottom of the ocean. And so those two processes are how we can get crystalline sedimentary rocks. And our third and final type of sedimentary rock is called bioclastic. That root word bio means life, and clastic, we already know, that means fragments or sediments. And so these are rocks that actually contain sediments, but they also contain pieces of organisms that were once alive. So these are rocks that form as the result of life processes. And the picture on the left here, this is limestone. Limestone is made up of a bunch of sometimes microscopic, which are teeny tiny shells or parts of shells, or sometimes they can be big shells like this. And you get a bunch of them that solidify together. Usually they fall to the bottom of the ocean, and then those rocks form from those shells. Or you can get something like this on the right-hand side, which is coal. Coal is just a sedimentary rock that forms from plant remains. So a long time ago, millions of years ago, there were swamps with giant plants that covered the earth, and eventually those plants died. And when water and dirt covered those plant remains millions and millions of years ago, eventually more and more sediments, dirt, uh, more and more rocks and sediments and dirt continued to pile up over top of them, and that heat and pressure compressed the plant remains together, and that's what creates coal. So again, you have sediments and remnants of living organisms, bioclastic rocks. All right, here's your first check for understanding. What are the three different types of sedimentary rocks and how are they formed? All right, another type of rock type that we learned about this week was metamorphic rocks. That word metamorphic comes from two words. Meta means change, and morph means form. And so these are rocks that change their form. And they change their form because of intense heat and or pressure, and this causes metamorphism. So metamorphism is the process that rocks go through when they have a lot of heat or pressure, and it changes them from one rock type to a metamorphic rock. And there are two different ways that rocks can go through metamorphism. One is called regional metamorphism, and the other is called contact metamorphism. These are both on your guided notes page. Regional metamorphism occurs over a large area or a large region. And this could be as large as New York State or maybe a couple of states like New York State and Connecticut, for example. And this happens sometimes because you have a lot of rocks that get deposited, and then more rock layers get deposited on top of that, and then more rock layers get deposited, and more rock layers. And as those rock layers deposit on top of other ones, the rocks at the bottom get compressed and squished together by pressure, and that causes those rocks to go through metamorphism. Sometimes the metamorphism can be a result of intense pressure that is involved in plate tectonics. You might have learned about plate tectonics in middle school, where you can have, for example, two plates colliding or pushing together, and that pushing together of two plates can also cause regional metamorphism. So you're changing big areas of rock from, say, sedimentary rock into metamorphic rock. And when this happens, mineral crystals get squished and they get altered. Altered is just another word for changed. A lot of times the mineral crystals, when they change, they line up with one another, or they get bigger. The second type of metamorphism is contact metamorphism, and this occurs where magma or lava comes into contact with the rocks that they cut through. So this is where magma actually touches other rocks. So here in this picture, we have some sedimentary rock here, and these were layers of sedimentary rock that were deposited. But then there might have been some cracks in the rock, and that allowed some sort of weakness. And so the magma that is deep underground might have pushed up in between those little cracks on its way up to the surface. And as it comes into contact with the sedimentary rock, it actually heats up that sedimentary rock, not to the point where it melts it. We're not turning it into an igneous rock, but we actually sometimes say that we're baking the rock. So we say that that rock gets baked. Um, and it actually changes that sedimentary rock just where it comes into contact, where these little lines are that I've drawn on the diagram here. Just where that rock comes into contact with the sedimentary rock, those tiny little areas get changed into metamorphic rocks. This can occur above ground, so you can have this magma come all the way up, and you can actually change some of the rock that is up here on the surface, or you can also change the rock underground. And with contact metamorphism, it's the heat that changes the rock, whereas in regional metamorphism, it was the pressure that changes the rock. So that's kind of a difference between the two. Okay, here is your check for understanding. How are regional and contact metamorphism different? And your second check for understanding about metamorphism, how are regional and contact metamorphism similar? So when metamorphic rocks are created, they usually have some very specific characteristics when they change. And the biggest one that we see in metamorphic rocks is something called foliation. Foliation. And all this is when minerals align. It's mineral alignment from the intense pressure. And the way I think of this word alignment, align actually sounds like a line. And so this is when minerals are lining up. And you can see that in this picture. All of these minerals that were in different orientations, some of them were horizontal, some were vertical, some were diagonal. And when you add this pressure and you push and you squish those rocks together, those minerals line up in more of a straight line. And this is a really cool picture of a metamorphic rock. You can see that some of these minerals have lined themselves up. And in addition to them lining themselves up, you can also see that there was probably some intense pressure from plate tectonics that squished that rock together, and it caused some of those minerals not only to align themselves, but then to fold a little bit. There's a nice fold happening right here. And sometimes you have so much pressure, or the pressure has lasted for so long that the foliation is really intense. And sometimes when that foliation is really intense, you have something called banding. And this is where you have bands of light colored minerals and dark colored minerals. And we call it banding. So you have this alignment of alternating dark and light minerals. Here's another example of banding. So you can see here's some dark minerals, and then here are some light minerals, and they're alternating, right? They're going back and forth. In New York City, we have a lot of metamorphic rock. This is a great picture right here in Central Park, and all of the rock that is here, this is actually a metamorphic rock. It's called schist. You have to be careful how you say that. But most of the bedrock in New York City is this metamorphic rock, and it's one of the reasons why we can have these big, tall skyscrapers, because metamorphic rock is a very strong, really hard rock that those skyscrapers can be supported by. Okay, here's a check for understanding. Is this rock that is shown in the picture foliation or banding? Okay, hopefully you got that right. This is really just foliation. We don't see banding in this picture. If you're not sure what those are, look back at your notes or go back and re-listen to that part, the previous part of the video. All right, here's another check. Once again, is this foliation or is this banding? Okay, our last rock type is igneous rocks. A lot of people have a hard time saying that word igneous. I just remember the word igneous comes from the word ignite. If you ignite something, you're turning it on fire, you're catching it on fire. So igneous comes from that word. And you remember from this week, we learned about igneous rocks and how they form from the cooling and solidification of magma. We also talked about how the solidification is also the crystallization of magma, because that's when mineral crystals are forming. And there is a distinction between lava and magma. Magma is what we call molten rock or melted rock that is deep underground. So this down here is a magma chamber because it's a place where magma is created underground or forming underground. But as soon as that magma comes up to the surface, and at one point in time this magma came up and the magma just kind of spilled out over top of some of these rocks, and then it solidified in place. And then more magma came up and then that spilled over and it solidified in place. And the same thing continued to repeat. The magma came up, it spilled out of the volcano as the volcano erupted, and it oozed out and then it solidified in place. And this is actually how a volcano forms, which is why we have all of these nice layers here. But once that magma comes up to the surface, we don't call it magma anymore. Once it's on the surface, that's when we start to call it lava. So it's just a distinction of where the molten rock is formed. It's exactly the same stuff. It's still molten rock or melted rock. It's just a location difference. And we actually don't have any igneous rock in New York City. In fact, there's no igneous rock found anywhere in New York State. We do have sedimentary rocks upstate in New York, and there's lots of metamorphic rocks here in New York City. But in order to find some igneous rocks, you'd have to go to New Jersey or a little bit farther away to find igneous rocks. One of the ways that we classify igneous rocks is based on how fast they cool. Granite is a type of rock that cools very slowly. And because it cools very slowly, we call it an intrusive, or sometimes we call it a plutonic igneous rock. And this is rock that cools inside, or I should say magma, molten rock that cools inside the earth or underground. And it cools, because it cools underground, it takes a while for it to cool off. It stays hot for longer because it's deep under where it's nice and hot. And so because of that, these rocks tend to have much larger crystals like this granite. You've probably seen granite countertops, or at least you've heard of granite countertops. A lot of people like these kinds of countertops because they are really hard rock. Igneous rock tends to be really hard rock, and they have these nice, pretty big crystals. If the magma cools more quickly, in other words, it explodes out of a volcano and it gets to the surface and it's then called lava and it cools very quickly, we have a fast cooling rate, then we call these rocks extrusive, or sometimes we'll call them volcanic igneous rock. And this was because I think of this as them exploding out of volcanoes, extrusive, exploding out of a volcano. And so these actually cool more quickly, and so they have very, very tiny crystals, or sometimes they don't have any crystals at all because remember, as magma is cooling, it's crystallizing, meaning that's when the mineral crystals are growing. So if the magma cools off very fast, that means it's becoming a solid quickly, and those mineral crystals aren't going to have a very long time to grow. And so that's why they have small crystals. This basalt is probably a rock you've never heard of before, but it makes up a lot of the rock at the bottom of the oceans, the ocean floor, they call it. And that kind of rock tends to have cooled very, very quickly. And you can see here that it really doesn't have very many sparkly mineral crystals in it at all. Okay, here's a check your understanding for igneous rocks. Distinguish between intrusive and extrusive igneous rocks. In other words, what is the difference between these two types of rocks? So igneous rocks can have big crystals, they can have little crystals, and then some igneous rocks can be light colored and they can be dark colored. This one on the left is called pumice, and you can see that this is a really light colored rock, and that's because it has light colored minerals. And so we call that rock felsic because it has feldspar minerals and silica minerals. So that's where the fel and sic part comes into play. We haven't talked about minerals yet, but when we do, you'll learn about feldspars and silica minerals, which are basically quartz minerals. And then the one on the right, and the rock on the right is called gabbro. You can tell that this rock is darker. It has dark colored minerals in it that contain magnesium, and that's where we get this word mafic from. It comes from the Ma part of magnesium. And they also have a lot of iron, which is a metal. Both of those are metals. The chemical formula for iron is Fe, and I think that's probably where they get the F, the mafic part of that term. All right, this is your final check for understanding. What is the difference between felsic and mafic igneous rocks?